The Alpini were formed in 1872, following Italy's unification, and were tasked with defending Italy's northern Alpine borders. Specialising in mountain warfare, the Alpini saw combat in many of Italy's conflicts and still exist to this day. And in this video, I'll be painting some of Warlord Games' World War II Alpini for bolt action. While the kit comes with a number of different options for uniform style, weaponry and equipment, I ultimately settled on a steel helm and carbine combination. After assembly, I primed the model ready for painting and settled on some of Colourforge's standard grey primer. The grey would help me with many of the natural tones that I will be applying, making it easier to apply those base coats. But first, let's hear from the sponsors of this video, Cheipeku. In tabletop RPGs, the setting is crucial. If you're a player, it's good for immersion and planning out your strategies, and if you're a GM, the visuals of the story you're telling are just as important as managing your monsters and traps. But getting that setting right isn't always straightforward. Fortunately, Cheipeku has your back. They are the creators behind over 4,000 breathtaking fantasy maps designed to elevate your tabletop adventures. From your classic adventuring locations to more eccentric locales like the Hell's Tax Office or the Lair of the Elder Brain. Cheipeku maps offer an extensive array of settings ready for you and your players to explore. But maybe you're glancing at that battle mat book on your shelf right now and thinking, I already have these. Well, not only are Cheipeku maps expanded with new additions being added every week, they are compatible with popular virtual platforms like Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds. Plus, you can immerse your players in dynamic, animated maps that will bring your encounters to life. So, however you play, you too can enjoy these wonderfully crafted locales. So, give your gaming sessions a boost and join this thriving community of adventurers for as little as $1 per creation over on Patreon. Check out the links in the description and the pinned comment below and start elevating your adventures today. When it came to painting this Alpini, I approached each area separately using the same few steps of base coat, wash, highlight and extreme highlight. The first area that I tackled was the uniform and helmet, and for these areas I selected some of the Tooth and Coat range's field grey. But before I applied the paint, I first thinned my paint down with a little water. This would allow me to apply a couple of thin layers of paint, leaving me with a solid starting colour without obscuring the details by applying the paint too thickly. When doing some research for this video, I found that the Alpini uniform to be represented in many different shades of grey, so quite typical for World War II painting. Some leaned more towards the blue tone, like those on the Alpini box, whilst other items were a little more greenish grey. My field grey base coat leaned towards the latter, but I still wanted to include a slight blue tone, so I mixed together some Tempest blue wash with a little Oblivion black to darken it down slightly. When applied across the uniform, it not only helped to pull into and darken down the recessed details, it also subtly adjusted the hue slightly, toning down the green somewhat and moving it closer to a neutral grey. To help add some variation though, I opted to wash the canteen and the helmet with just Oblivion black wash. This helped to retain the subtle green tone and helped to differentiate these details from the fatigues. With the washes in place, I then cleaned up any areas where I'd applied the wash a little too heavily by applying more field grey. This time around though, I avoided painting into the deepest recesses. With the wash helping to darken the recesses, my next step was to pick out the raised details with an edge highlight of Ranger Cloak. Some thin lines of this lighter paint were applied to the creases in the fabric, which helped to emphasize them and add to the model's level of detail. The next step was optional and saw me applying small dots to only the most extreme details, such as sharp corners where two edges met. This is known as an extreme highlight. From here, I then repeated that same process for each of the remaining areas. To paint the khaki pouches and straps, I began with a base coat of green beret. Washed them with some Archaic Sepia, before highlighting their edges, first with some Skeleton Legion, and then a few small spots of Ivory Tusk to finish off. The wooden furniture of the rifle and the leather sling were then both given a base coat of cuirass leather. This next step saw me continue the warm reddish-brown coloration with some highlights of boar hide, and finally some fur cloak. To paint the soldier's skin around his face and hands, my first step was to apply a base coat of barbarian brawn. Instead of next applying a wash though, I instead skipped straight towards the highlights. Some Dwarven skin was applied as my first highlight. For these areas, I made sure to keep my applications light in order to recreate those more subtle facial tones. I then finished off the skin with a few small spots of Elven skin. The next area of focus was the black leather and metallic areas. Each of these were base coated with some Death Reaper. The leather areas of the helmet strap and boots were then given a base coat of Dungeon Stone Grey. And finally, an extreme highlight of Wizard Grey. The remaining areas of Death Reaper included the metal parts of the rifle as well as a few buckles. To recreate the appearance of blackened steel, these details were then highlighted with some Surcoat silver. The end result was the appearance of a darkened metal with a few small scratches of brighter steel. Alpini helmets often had a stenciled crest on the front of them, and as the bolt action kit came with these as decals, I decided to add some to the model, but I first needed to prep the area. I did this by coating the front of the helmet with some gloss varnish. Once dried, this would achieve two things, creating a smooth surface to apply the decal to, and adding a layer of protection to the paint beneath. After giving the varnish a chance to dry, the decal was cut out from the sheet and left to sit in some water for a couple of minutes until it was lifting from the backing paper. Then, using a damp brush, I carefully nudged the decal from its paper and into place at the front of the helmet where it was left to dry. To help create that painted on look to the stencil, some microsol was applied over the top of the decal. This softens the transfer a little, allowing it to better sit against the surface. After giving everything a good chance to dry, I then sealed the decal in place with a very carefully applied layer of matte varnish. I could have left the decal alone at this stage, but I was looking for more of a weathered look. So using some of that earlier Kobold Grey, albeit in a much smaller amount, I carefully painted a few patches over the decal. As this dried, it gave me the impression of the stencil being worn away, leaving the original helmet colour visible beneath. With the model itself complete, I could turn my attention to the base. For this, I decided to keep things simple and go for a generic grassy field look, and to create the ground itself, I opted to use some AK Dark Earth. I just needed to carefully apply the textured paste across the base and around the feet, leave it to dry, and I was left with a pretty good looking soil texture. However, it could be improved with a quick application of a Bolivian blackwash, which helped me to bring out that texture even further. The base was now ready for some static grass, but before I broke out the tufts, I gave everything a coat of matte varnish to reduce some of the glossiness caused by the washes and to protect the paintwork. And finally, I superglued a gamer grass tuft and PVA'd a few patches of green static grass. By using a variation of greens and height here, I was able to create a much more natural looking grass field effect. And with that, I was left with this. And so that was my guide on how to paint your Italian Alpini for bolt action. Now this was a slightly more involved paint scheme, but if you're looking for a speedier and more straightforward way to paint a large number of Alpini quickly, you can quite easily omit a few steps. Simply ignore the extreme highlights, the decals, and maybe limit your highlights to the upper parts of each model, and you'll be able to paint up your squads to a good tabletop standard in no time. Now, it's been a while since I tackled some bolt action miniatures, so if this is the first time you're watching one of these, then please do check out my previous videos in the pinned playlist, or if you have suggestions for new factions or even revisits of factions I tackled in the past, then let me know in the comments below. But before I go, I just want to give my thanks to my Patreon supporters and channel members who help to keep this channel going, especially my Pouch of Dead Animal Bits and above supporters who are Andrew Console, Axel Jonsson, Berserker, Bits of Wargaming, Chris Reynolds, Daniel Dowling, Gabe Benavides, Ilniro Galari, Immaterial Creations, Maciej Savitsky, Mollywalk, Mr. Grimm, Nima, Pale Juice, Ryan Little, Swedsman, Tim, Tom Haysmith, and War Novice. And my Sergeant level channel members who are Omnitom, Coach Kato, Roll One to Explode, S.O., Phoenix's Den, Lloyd Davies, Trooper Geo, David, John Gibbs, The Sire Acquired, Nerdington Paint, Mark Taylor, Whale Tussler, and Philip Poya. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.